Hello, and welcome to part one of a new series we're calling Grain of Salt, where books, movies, or shows are judged by their depiction of a particular place, by someone who's lived there. Today's state is Alaska. I called it home for over a decade, but even if I was young when I left, it's still quite vivid in my mind. And I've visited several times since then. Today I'll be using that experience to see if some depictions are in any way accurate to the real thing. I set this up as a sort of head-to-head match where two different titles with similar themes are compared to each other, with one being more accurate than the other. The themes I've made are Native Characters Solving a Mystery, You Cannot Escape Your Past, and Comic Dramas in Movies and TV. Every title I'll be discussing is available in the Spartanburg Library system, and some are available through digital services like Libby or Hoopla. So if these titles interest you, feel free to check them out. So enough lollygagging, let's get to it. First off, I have the theme I entitled Native Characters Solving a Mystery, each facing some obstacle due in part to their indigenous identity. And this is an important thing to consider. 15% of the state's population are in the Native community, and as the main minority there's a history of conflict between the indigenous peoples and the white settlers. The first book I read that fits this theme is called White Sky, Black Ice by Stan Jones. In this novel, Nathan Active, a native-born, white-raised state trooper, is stationed at his original village far above the Arctic Circle. Two suspicious suicides within the same week rock the village, but Active is the only one who seems to think there's a larger plot afoot. His investigation is hindered by the village's opinion of him being half-white and pushback from the trooper force itself, but he is determined to discover what lies beneath all this. As someone who has no experience in that very rural and oh-so-cold part of the state, I still feel the book offered a very realistic depiction that honestly made me homesick. Whether it was how local dialect is portrayed or subtle name drops to particular items I remember seeing around. This book's primary focus, however, rests on the rural native experience, and I felt that was done with great care. This overall accuracy makes sense because the author has lived there nearly his whole life, with the fictional village in the book being based off the real town of Kotzebue. Overall, I'd say that this is one of the most accurately detailed depictions I've seen of Alaska yet, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that we have a number of this author's books in the library's collection. I'm not big on mysteries, but I just might read the others on my own time. I want to compare this novel to The Boy in the Snow by M.J. McGrath. This is the second book in the series, and even though I did not read the first, it still made sense without it. The main character of the series, Edie Kiglatuk, is a half-white, half-Inuit woman supporting her ex-husband's Iditarod run. However, her plans are thrown into disarray when she comes across the body of an infant in the snowy wilderness. After reporting with the police, she feels that there's more to this and risks life and limb to discover how deep this rabbit hole goes. I wasn't anticipating the same level of accuracy as in Jones's book, as the author seems to be English and has only visited the state. The locations within this book are all real and are all centered around my former neck of the woods. Because of this familiarity, I was able to identify several peculiar inaccuracies in community names. For example, places that I would often frequent, like Meadow Lakes and Hatcher Pass, here transformed into Meadow Lake, just the one, and the Hatcher Pass. To me, that's like reading a book on the upstate and seeing towns like Spartansburg or the Glen Springs. The protagonist hails from northern Canada, so perhaps some in-character misunderstandings are to be expected, but it still threw me for a loop. Either way, I felt like White Sky, Black Ice was more accurate of the two mysteries. Now let's look at two titles that share the theme of impossibility of escaping your past. By this, I'm referring to the narrative idea that despite many people perceiving Alaska to be a magical place to leave old problems behind and begin again, it can be a bit more than what one bargains for. A not insignificant portion of people living up there came for a fresh start, but kind of want to leave now. Living up there is only for certain people. Either you never want to leave, or you want to get on the next plane out. It can really affect people mentally, and these two stories feature these effects at its most provocative and its worst. Starting with the provocative, let's talk about Heroes of the Frontier by Dave Eggers. In this novel, we follow Josie, a mother of two who, after losing her dental practice and her husband, decides to escape with her kids to Alaska, rent an RV, and travel across the state aimlessly. Other than briefly visiting a sisterly relative of Josie's, they are completely alone. As the journey unfolds, so does Josie, and we see her inner workings and peer into her past. As purely statistical fact goes, this one falls quite a bit short. Judging by approximate landmarks, I'm able to tell that certain trips that would take maybe a number of hours in real life somehow end up taking multiple days in the book. Sure, they're unfamiliar with the area, but that kind of discrepancy is pretty vast. Various environmental differences stuck out too, such as the constant use of the term interstate to refer to the highways. There are no other states to connect to, so we just say highway. Also, the appearance of snakes, which is impossible because we have zero reptiles. That being said, there are a few things it does get right, such as how the mountains and trees are described, which I felt were fairly accurate. I did speculate that these inaccuracies are made to show the main character's mind slowly slipping, as she does make some questionable actions in the book, but who knows if that's what's intended. A big red flag for inaccuracy, but I did find the character study going on to be quite interesting. If that sounds like your cup of tea, I'd suggest it, but maybe not if you're doing a school report on the state. Keeping that mental spiraling in mind, let's look at The Great Alone by Kristen Hanna, but instead of the main character losing it, it's her father. We meet Lenny, whose family has moved to an isolated community in southern Alaska after her father's army friend left a portion of land to them. Lenny's father, who suffers from PTSD, which fuels cycles of domestic abuse, hopes that this change in lifestyle will help him recover. However, as time passes, he becomes more and more unstable and isolates the family further away from the outside world. The story follows Lenny and her mother's lives over the years in Alaska, and Lenny's romantic endeavors with the son of a man her father hates. This story takes place during the 1970s, which is a time that I was neither living in Alaska nor alive at all, so I'm certainly not experienced with that particular life, so I ask you to take this with a grain of salt. They don't dwell on too many environmental details, as this is very much a plot-driven drama, but it gets certain things right, like the overall oceanside life and the inconceivable mass of mosquitoes one will inevitably witness if you step in the woods during the summer. If you want family drama, romance, and a dash of historical Alaskan life, this might be the book for you. As for which of the last two I think would be most accurate, I think this one wins. Last, I want to talk about comic dramas and movies and TV, but set in Alaska. That being said, few films are shot up there, as it can be quite expensive, and setting up a camera crew in the Pacific Northwest or in rural Canada is a much more viable option. Keep that in mind, as this applies to both of these titles. For a movie set in Alaska, I watched The Big White by Mark Mylod. Paul Barnell, played by Robin Williams, is a travel agent who is drowning in debt whilst trying to care for his possibly Tourette's-afflicted wife. After coming across a corpse near his business, he hatches a scheme to present the body to his insurance agency as his long-lost brother and gain a $1 million payout. However, one fraud agent is not convinced and investigates further. What follows is a lot of shenanigans involving the corpse, criminal henchmen, and the surprise appearance of the real, living brother. The travel agency that Williams' character runs seems to rely heavily on visiting Hawaii, which definitely matches up with reality, as Hawaii is pretty much the main vacation spot for nearly everyone living in Alaska. The whole thing was filmed in the Yukon Territory in Canada, but they cared enough to use the right license plates and a few other minor details. As for the film itself, it's definitely a comedy, and a dark comedy at that. The whole plot revolves around a corpse. Of course it's dark. I'd say that it's caught somewhere in the middle between Fargo and Weekend at Bernie's, and it's surprisingly still pretty enjoyable. Big plus for making an actually entertaining movie. For a representative TV show, I went for an overlooked 90s classic, Northern Exposure. In it, Joel Fleischman, a recent med school graduate from Columbia University, has to begin his practice in Alaska due to a scholarship. Instead of the Anchorage office he planned to be at, he's whisked away to the fictional small town of Sicily, home to some off-the-wall characters like former astronaut and big man in town Maurice, young Tlingit native Ed, bush pilot and leading lady Maggie, and many more. The show follows the trials and tribulations of the community, with interpersonal spats and reflection throughout. The townsfolk in the show all have some idiosyncrasy, and oddball communities certainly are up there in real life. Every place has something off that separates it, whether it be having a cat for a mayor, placing bets on when the frozen river will crack, and growing absurdly large cabbages, or some other unusual activity I've yet to know. There are some inaccuracies, the most obvious being a very prominent sign advertising snowmobiles. In reality, we call them snow machines. That term is really the only weird terminology that you'll come across up there, so if you say snowmobile, you'll have a tourist label slapped on you in no time. Needless to say, this show is still quite popular up there, and my family can attest to that. It's a fun show, but it's definitely a combination of comedy and drama, so it's not a laugh track kind of show. Definitely entertaining, but still fairly accurate. This one might just edge out the last one for being the most accurate of the two. I hope I've inspired you to pick up one of these titles. However, I do not recommend moving up there unless you are completely prepared for the long cold winters, dangerous driving, expensive everything, and the inability to travel by car to anywhere else. It certainly ain't a 3-hour drive to the sunny beaches. Anyway, thank you for listening, and be sure to tune in next month on July 28th, where another installment of Grain of Salt, this time visiting the Garden State of New Jersey. I will not be hosting, but you're going to learn a lot from someone who did live there. Bye!